Welcome, everyone. This is Philip Ellis. I'm a cattleman from Chugwater, Wyoming, and currently serve as president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to NCBA's webinar on a very important and hot topic in our industry, preparing cattlemen for changing antibiotic use regulations. Here's some of the things for tonight's webinar. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the chat box on your screen, and at the end of the presentations, questions will be moderated to our presenters by Josh White, part of our NCBA producer education team. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available by the end of the week at beefusa.org. Now, we have several speakers joining us from across the country, and bear with us as we change from speaker to speaker during the course of the webinar. There might be a brief pause in the discussion. We have outstanding presenters and speakers who will provide the most up-to-date information on antibiotic regulations and the impact they will have on our cattle operations. Speakers tonight include Dr. Mike Apley, Professor of Production Medicine and Clinical Pharmacology at Kansas State University. But we'll start our program with Dr. Craig Lewis, a veterinary medical officer at the FDA's Center for Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Lewis, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I'm going to provide a brief background on FDA's Guidance for Industry 209 and 213 and discuss why it's important that vets and producers become familiar with the new VFD regulations, go over the drugs that are affected by Guidance 213 and some of the drugs that aren't, go over the new VFD regulation, and go over some of the frequently asked questions. Antibiotic use in animal agriculture, as I'm sure folks are aware, it's been a subject of intense scientific and policy debate for decades, particularly as it relates to antimicrobial resistance concerns. Consumers and public health advocates, Congress, and many other stakeholders continue to be concerned about the public health impacts. FDA's Guidance for Industry 152, which is a risk assessment, a qualitative risk assessment process that we use in our pre-approval drug evaluation process, provides assurance that any new antibiotic products are safe. Focus of our recent efforts has been on taking steps to assure that the existing antibiotics, those that predate the 2003 assessment process, are used as judiciously as possible. FDA's judicious use strategy is the overall policy direction as described in Guidance 209. It was finalized in 2012, but was published first in this draft form in 2010, so almost 5 years ago today. So this policy has been under discussion, and there have been several rounds of public input into the policy and formulating it. The policy is essentially two key principles. One, limiting use of medically important antimicrobial drugs to those uses considered necessary for ensuring animal health, in other words, for therapeutic purposes, and two, limiting such drugs to uses that include vet oversight or consultation. Guidance 213 is the follow-up document to Guidance 209. Guidance 209 states the policy. Guidance 213 provides more details about implementing that policy, including definitions of medically important and process for drug sponsors to update their labels, and data required to obtain approval of any new therapeutic uses. December 2016 is the target for drug companies to implement the changes to their affected products, which include withdrawing approved production uses and requiring vet oversight. So December 16 is the target for completing all those changes under Guidance 213. The definition of the effective drugs are medically important antimicrobials that are administered in feed or water and are available over the counter, and any drugs within that meet those criteria that are also whether or not they're approved for production uses, such as weight gain or feed efficiency. Medically important antimicrobials in particular are all drugs and their associated classes listed in Guidance 152 that I mentioned earlier. which contains an appendix ranking different drugs according to their importance in human medicine. Drugs that are not currently classified as medically important according to that appendix are not affected, for example, bacitracin and the ionophores. Those drugs that are medically important, in other words, listed in Appendix A, but are administered through other routes such as injection, are not affected by Guidance 213. And there are some products that are medically important that are administered in feed or water and are currently not available over the counter. Those products are also already considered aligned with Guidance 213. Veterinary oversight, and the objective of veterinary oversight is not to require the vet to directly administer these drugs, but to involve them in the decision-making process. And practically speaking, this means changing from over-the-counter to either prescription, or in the case of medicated feeds, to veterinary feed directive. Water-soluble products would be changing to prescription. This table tries to summarize the currently approved drugs and the major food-producing species that they're approved for, as well as the OTC drugs that will be changing to VFD by the end of 2016. So really starting in 2017, these drugs listed here on the lower half of the page will be changing from OTC to VFD. Currently, there's only these 3 different drug ingredients that are under VFD status. The other impacts of Guidance 213 more broadly, there's some impacts on minor species. Some of these products are approved for sheep, goat, fish, honeybees, lobsters, and so forth. As mentioned earlier, the uses of those products for growth promotion or feed efficiency will no longer be allowed after those changes are made at the end of 2016. One other impact is that if a combination feed contains 1 or more VFD drugs, the entire combination effectively becomes a VFD, requiring vet oversight and authorization. The Veterinary Feed Directive, a little bit of background on that, was based on a law passed by Congress in 1996, and FDA finalized our regulations in the year 2000. So this marketing status has been around for quite some time, although there have been relatively few products that have fallen under this marketing status. FDA decided to update the current VFD, or the old VFD process at this point, in order to make the process more efficient and really to facilitate this widespread adoption of the VFD marketing status as called for under Guidance 213. So while the change to the regulation doesn't force the change to any of these products, it's actually intended to facilitate it by making the VFD process more efficient while retaining the public health protections intended by the regulation. The VFD final rule was just published at the beginning of this month, on June 3rd. On October 1st, that rule will go into effect for those 3 different ingredients that are currently under that status. Again, it'll be another year and a half until the remainder of the OTC products convert to VFD. FDA also published a draft Guidance 120 and actually an update to an existing question and answers document related to the Veterinary Feed Directive regulation. The public comment period for that document is currently open. I provided a link at the end of this slide set for folks who wish to look at the document and to submit comments. The VFD final rule has a number of major provisions, and so I'm going to go through some of the revised definition, all the information that's required on the VFD, and some of the optional information that the vet can include, as well as some of the commonly asked questions that we've received on the vet-client-patient relationship, expiration dates, refills, and so forth. So some of the definitions we had to change in this final rule. Just to clarify, we're going to use some of these terms later in this presentation, so I wanted to include them as a reference point here. In particular, the combination VFD drug, is important and comes into play in a few places. Distributors is the third party in the VFD authorization process, in addition to the veterinarian and the client. With the understanding that the folks here on this call are primarily vets and producers, I won't spend much time on this, other than to say that there's two types of distributors. Really, one type that only distributes the feed, and another kind of distributor who both manufactures as well as distributes the feed. So this actually may, in the case of the latter, there may be clients or producers who are also feed manufacturers or acting as distributors themselves. So some folks who are effectively producers or clients in this exchange may also be distributors under the VFD authorization process. Drug categories is one of the major changes that we made as a result of our update to the VFD rule. All drugs are categorized into one of two categories depending on their potential to create unsafe drug residues. Category 1 has the lowest potential and 2 has the highest residue potential. And that categorization determines whether the feed manufacturer facility needs to be licensed in order to handle the drug in its type A form, in its most concentrated form. So we revised the definition of Category 2, which previously automatically classified VFD drugs into that highest potential, more restricted category. Instead, from this point forward, the Category 2 drugs will be defined as drugs that require withdrawal period at the lowest level in at least one species, or are regulated on a non-residue basis as a result of carcinogenic concerns. And this includes existing VFD products in addition to any of the products that convert to VFD under Guidance 213. There's a number of different pieces of information which are required by the vet to fill out the VFD form in order for it to be valid, including the name, address, telephone number, the premise where the animals are located, the date of issuance and the expiration date, the name of the VFD drug or drugs, species and production class, the approximate number of animals. This is a change that I'll go into a little bit more detail on later. The indication for which the VFD is issued, the level of the drug in the feed, and the duration of use. That's been adjusted slightly in this final rule. Withdrawal time special instructions and other cautionary information, the number of reorders or refills, only if permitted. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later as well as a few additional pieces of information. The number 13 affirmation of whether the VFD drugs should be used alone or in an improved combination is another topic I'll go into a little bit more in depth here in a moment. The VFD regulation also specifies some optional information that the veterinary can include on the VFD form if at their discretion, which includes more specific identification of the animals to be fed, indicating whether or not a substitution by the feed manufacturer of the Pioneer or the generic on the form, whether that is not allowed if it's not specified. If the vet does not specify that a substitution is not permitted, the feed manufacturer may use an approved substitute, and any other information the vet deems appropriate in the context of the authorization. Now, I'll go into a few specific topic areas before we turn it over to Dr. Apley. The vet-client-patient relationship is one area which we received a lot of comment on, and we've made a change from the existing regulations, really to defer wherever possible to the state-defined vet-client-patient relationship. In particular, in the cases where that state definition includes the key elements of the valid VCPR as defined in FDA's extra label use regulations, which was the previous VCPR requirement under the VFD regulation. In cases where there is no such applicable state requirement, then effectively the VCPR requirement will default to the veterinarian or to the federal definition. Those three key concepts include that the vet engages with the client to assume responsibility for making clinical judgments, have sufficient knowledge of the patient by virtue of examination and visits to the facility, and provide any necessary follow-up evaluation or care. So those are the three key elements. We're going to be working with the state regulatory authorities to verify whether each state has VCPR requirements in place that apply to issuance of the VFD and include those key elements of the federally defined VCPR that I just mentioned. And FDA's plans to publish an online list of such states at the time that Guidance 120 publishes. And this list will have to be periodically updated as we receive and verify information, and potentially as the states change their VCPR definitions so that their state definitions will be the operational definition. So effectively, this sets up a scenario where the state definition, if it can apply, it will effectively be the operational form. But in the case where there is no VCPR defined by the state or otherwise, that there is a vet client patient relationship definition that will apply. Now, expiration date and duration of use are two concepts which are subtly different from one another, so I wanted to go through what some of the differences are and what their implications. Expiration date specifies the last day that the VFD feed can be fed. The feed or combination should not be fed after the expiration date, and this expiration is either specified on the product approval, or if not, it cannot exceed 6 months. The vet can use their judgment to determine whether a shorter period is warranted, however. So this is either specified on the product approval or at a maximum 6 months, although the vet can designate a shorter time. The duration of use is the length of time that any individual animal can be fed feed containing the VFD drug. And this is a separate concept from the expiration date, and which is also established as part of the approval or conditional approval or index listing process. If the VFD order will expire before completing the duration of use on the order, the client needs to contact their vet to request a new VFD order because the VFD feed cannot be fed outside of that expiration period. Refills are another concept that are built into the regulation. Currently, there's no approved VFD drugs that allow for a VFD refill or reorder. And if the label remains silent, a refill may not be authorized. One of the changes that was made in the final regulation was a shift from requiring the exact number of animals and the amount of feed that we're authorized to use to designating the approximate number of animals that were expected to be fed prior to the expiration date. This is with acknowledgement that animals may leave or enter the group to be fed during that period of time, and the comments we received regarding problems calculating the amount of feed and the need to write additional authorizations due to underestimations or record-keeping issues. So we revised the current requirement so that it means the approximate number of animals, which are the potential number of animals of the species and production class identified to be fed prior to that expiration date. In addition, we're removing the requirement to specify the amount of feed to be fed, so the vet can instead include the duration on the VFD. Related to combination drugs, we've included another required piece of information for the vet to designate one of 3 affirmation of intent statements, which is essentially clarify whether that VFD is meant to authorize the single ingredient, the VFD drug in a specific combination, or the VFD drug in any approved combination, an attempt to strike a balance between reducing the risk of illegal combinations being distributed, as well as the need for the vet to be able to use their medical judgment. Now that gets us through essentially the vet completing the VFD authorization. transmitting and record keeping as are some other areas of the regulation. This diagram attempts to depict the flow from the original VFD order, authorization, transmission by either hard copy, facsimile, or electronic, and the fate of those documents as they reach the client and the distributor, the other two parties in the exchange. All involved parties must keep a copy of the VFD on file and available for inspection for 2 years. That retains the original VFD in its original form, whether that was electronic or hard copy. Distributor and client copies may be kept as electronic or hard copy. VFD distributors have some separate record-keeping requirements in addition to the VFD requirements related to good manufacturing practices and so forth. In summary, the timeline there's many other questions, we'll save them for the question and answer session. The implementation summary for Guidance 213, in particular as it relates to the VFD process. In August 3rd, the comment period for the Q&A document on the VFD regulation closes, and the link that I've provided here at regulations.gov, if you click on that, you should be able to submit comments to that docket. October 1st, the VFD final rule goes into effect, and again, this applies to the current VFD drugs. December 2016 is our target for drug sponsors to complete the changes to their affected products. That's when the vast majority of the affected drugs will change from over-the-counter to veterinary feed directive. In the case of medicated feeds, or prescription if they're water-soluble products. And at the same time, the production indications from those drugs, if any, will be removed. So effectively on January 1st, all medically important antimicrobials used in an in or on feed will require a VFD, and those in the drinking water will require a prescription. I included a number of additional references and resources related to our documents here, and with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Epley.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm going to take control here. There we go. Thanks, and it's an excellent introduction to what we have before us as we move to the new VFD rule. What I wanted to do was take a minute and re-emphasize some of the points from Dr. Lewis and take it from the aspect of someone who's ready to lay feed down this bunk line or prepare to go obtain a medicated milk replacer or a medicated mineral, exactly what kind of procedure you might go through. So what would be your procedure for a feed containing a medically important antibiotic? And it's important to recognize that there are some that are covered under the VFD and some for which it is not required, and we'll reinforce some of those in a little quiz here later where everyone can decide whether you'd actually need to have a VFD for that. So your veterinarian may recommend this medically important antibiotic to be contained in the feed based on a response to a disease challenge identified in your ongoing relationship with that veterinarian in the course of their clinical practice, or as we transition to VFD drug labels for some that have not already had that label, this may have been a disease control, prevention, or treatment regimen you've used over the years and have now approached your veterinarian for authorization of this use at the time in January 1, 2017, when all of this will be in place and that will be required. So as you initiate this conversation with your veterinarian, I would ask that you please be prepared that this is not an automatic authorization. It will initiate a conversation with your veterinarian that will include things such as consideration of non-antibiotic alternatives, the legality, which is does it match the label. And Dr. Lewis mentioned, and we'll return to several times, that the legality of use is determined by whether the application complies with the label. And that can include things such as dose, duration, and indication of use, among other things. Your veterinarian will also evaluate the need for the use in consideration of authorizing the veterinary feed directive drug to be used, and then also the efficacy of the proposed antibiotic use in relation to your disease challenge. I think it's important to recognize that rather than any type of burden, this actually will, I think, drive some interactions, maybe perhaps at some different levels in relation to feed use than have occurred perhaps in some relationships before. And then the ability to meet the withdrawal time prior to slaughter. The veterinarian is also tasked with considering issues of antimicrobial resistance across multiple fronts. So when you put these things together, this helps us understand exactly what will be going through your veterinarian's mind as they consider the application, potential application of this drug in the feed. And also, please understand again that your veterinarian can only legally authorize a use of a prescription drug or a VFD drug within the context of a veterinary client-patient relationship. This VCPR will be based on definitions within your state, or if that VCPR does not meet the basic requirements or is not present, then it will default to the federal definition of a veterinary client-patient relationship. And your veterinarian will exercise their clinical judgment based on their training experience within the confines of the law. In this case, the law, what they can prescribe, is defined by the label. So, we're back to our procedure for a feed containing a medically important antibiotic. So, if appropriate, your veterinarian will complete either a written or electronic veterinary feed directive form. This may be a written form provided by a manufacturer of a veterinary feed directive drug. It may be a feed directive form created by your veterinarian themselves, or it may be an electronic format. Dr. Lewis summarized some of the ways in which those will be distributed, but in the case of a veterinarian, a distributor, and the client of the veterinarian who will be using the drug, 3 copies will be created, and each of those parties will end up with one of the copies. Your veterinarian will keep a copy, provide you with one, and provide your designated provider of the medicated feed with a copy, and this provider will need to be authorized by the state to dispense medicated feed on the order of that veterinarian. So let's go through some scenarios and see about whether or not a VFD would be required. So our first scenario is a milk replacer with neomycin and oxytetracycline as medications in that milk replacer. So decide if you would need to get a veterinary feed directive for that. And the answer is yes, you would. A milk replacer is a feed, and drugs that are approved to be added to milk replacer are approved as feed additives. It's important to remember that the FDA actually approves the label. They approve manufacturing processes for the drug to assure that it's pure and that it's the potency it should be, but when they actually approve something in the approval process, it is the label for that drug. So here's another question: chlortetracycline in the feed for foot rot. So let's say you are experiencing a foot rot outbreak, in a group of cattle, and you've asked your veterinarian about the potential for using chlortetracycline in the feed to try to control that. Well, in this case, your veterinarian will not be able to provide that because foot rot as an indication for chlortetracycline in the feed for cattle is not on the label. So since that is not a label use, it is not allowed, and to write that VFD would be illegal. What about a mineral or feed with chlortetracycline for anaplasmosis prevention? It's not uncommon in my area of the world here in Kansas and many other areas that starting vector season here later this summer and on to, say, 30 days past that first hard freeze, we may provide chlorotetracycline in the mineral or feed as labeled to control clinical cases of anaplasmosis. And the answer is yes. You will need to obtain a veterinary feed directive authorization to obtain that product to either add or have in that mineral or feed for that purpose. Tylosin for reduction in liver abscesses. And the answer there is yes. Tylosin has this approval. It is a legal use. It's been shown to be safe and effective in the approval process, and therefore a veterinarian may authorize that in the course of clinical practice. Now let's think about monensin, trade name Rumensin, which you may recognize as the only antibiotic in the ration. So will you need a VFD in order to feed monensin as the only antibiotic in a ration? The answer is no. This is not a medically important antibiotic, so therefore was not the subject of Guidance 209 in requiring that any growth promotion uses be removed, nor is it required to have a veterinary feed directive in order to be used. What about feeding monensin concurrently with tylosin? This is an approved combination, so will you need a veterinary feed directive in this case? And the answer is yes. The VFD for tylosin would need to contain an authorization for the concurrent feeding of monensin. The veterinarian would authorize the feeding of tylosin and then would also authorize the concurrent feeding of monensin with it. So the combination thusly requires a VFD. And what about chlorotetracycline or oxytetracycline in the feed for treatment of bovine respiratory disease? Many of you may recognize this as the 1 gram per 100 pounds or 10 milligrams per pound dosing rate, which is approved for treatment of bovine respiratory disease. And the answer is yes. Your veterinarian will need to authorize that and will need to specify the number of animals, where they're at, the dose to be fed, and the regimen surrounding that dose, and then also the expiration date for the veterinary feed directive, which authorizes that use. So here's a question I've run into as I've discussed this with veterinarians and producers, and that is, will I need a new veterinary feed directive for each pen of cattle in a feedlot or each time I pick up a medicated mineral? So your veterinarian will determine multiple specifications on the veterinary feed directive, and Dr. Lewis had a list there of many of the things that will need to be specified. I'm going to focus on just a few, and these include the regimen. So the veterinarian will include the regimen dose duration within label options, and some labels may have only one option, and some may contain a range of doses within which your veterinarian will specify the dose in this veterinary feed directive. Another is the number of cattle in which the VFD drug may be fed, the amount of the VFD drug which may be purchased, and the duration of use. So this is the length of time the VFD drug is allowed to be fed to the animals, and the expiration date of the VFD, and that specifies the last day the veterinary feed directive drug can be fed. So in answer to the top one, the veterinarian can specify a number of animals which may allow for animals in multiple pens to be treated based on their relationship with their client and directions of use. It is important to recognize that, say, the expiration date for the VFD is 10 days from now, and that the duration of use for the drug that is on the label is 14 days. that drug could not be fed without another VFD being put into place by the veterinarian, which would cover the remainder of that feeding period. So it's important to review that the entire duration of use of the veterinary feed directive drug must be concluded within the dates of a valid veterinary feed directive. What about water versus feed? This has been a source of a little confusion on this, but as of December 2016 is when the transition will occur, as Dr. Lewis said, and January 1, 2017 was when all is expected to be in place. But all medically important antibiotics used in the feed will require a veterinary feed directive. There is no legal use of in-feed drugs other than is provided for on the label. This is the law today and will not change as we go forward. All medically important antibiotics used in the water will require a prescription at this time. Now, this prescription for water use may indicate extra label use of the antibiotic in water if the requirements of the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act, which we know as AMDUCA, regulations are met. This means that the veterinarian has a VCPR, is familiar with the care of the animals, is able to be familiar with their care and keeping or provide a presumptive diagnosis. All of those requirements in the AMDUCA regulations must be met, and then the veterinarian, within their clinical practice in relation to this case, may authorize extra label use. So a really big difference between veterinary feed directive drugs used in the feed and drugs which will require a prescription to be used in the water. And this is really a big take-home I'd like to have in place from this presentation, is that it all revolves around the label. And the labels will be different for different products, and you and your veterinarian will need to understand the specifics of use for each of those labels and the details that are contained within that veterinary feed directive. And it is, again, it is currently the law for in-feed use of all drugs that there is no extra label use, and the fact that there will be a requirement for a veterinarian to authorize in-feed use of these medically important antibiotics does not change this law. Again, a veterinarian may still prescribe extra label use of an injectable or water-delivered drug under the AMDUCA regulations. So before we head to some questions, which we wanted to allow plenty of time for, I just wanted to really emphasize that your veterinarians are actively engaged with the FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine in initiating the VFD process. Dr. Lewis, as well as Dr. Bill Flynn, have been to many of our meetings, for example, the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, the Academy of Veterinary Consultants, to state meetings, the AVMA, and they've been very engaged with us through the development of the veterinary feed directive. There have been multiple opportunities for engagement as far as key questions and what they need to address in the rule through meetings held around the country, and also just a lot of interaction, a lot of two-way communication, and I can say that we've appreciated that opportunity to have that interaction. And your veterinarians are continuing to engage in training on the VFD process, as well as all aspects of the approved labels. So veterinarians are well aware of what's coming up. They are, we've already had, again, multiple discussions at meetings, and you should be assured that meetings in 2016 will be very heavy with training on the VFD process. We are also having conversations with nutritionists, with feed manufacturers, as well as regulatory personnel at the federal and state level. A lot of stuff is going on. I think this presentation gives you a really good handle on the basics of what to expect. And one of the best things you can do is, as you think through these and have questions on scenarios, is to talk with your veterinarians, and we'll continue to evolve some of our understanding as we move forward. And the last thing is your veterinarians are completely committed to working with their clients on this, committed to providing the service, and there may be some things to work through. One of the big things to understand is that to obtain a veterinary feed directive drug may take more time than deciding I want it here on Friday afternoon at 4:30 and being able to go obtain the veterinary feed directive and go get it. So there's some planning, and I'm always of the opinion that planning is really, really a good thing. So we'll work together, and I think we'll find this provides some opportunities. With that, I'd like to turn it back to our moderator, and I would like to think we'll entertain some questions.
Thank you to both our presenters tonight. One of the things NCBA does best is bring folks together from across the industry and provide the best information available for cattlemen for our ranch here in Wyoming. I think we've achieved those objectives tonight with this great webinar. As we moved into our question and answer session, I also want to invite everyone to the upcoming Cattle Industry Summer Conference being held July 16th to 18th in Denver. Great opportunity to hear more in-depth information on current issues and opportunities for you in the cattle industry and to help to chart the course of the cattle industry for the future. Now, I also encourage you to join me as a member of NCBA if you are not already. Now I'm going to turn it over to Josh White with NCBA to moderate our question and answer session. Stay on the line. I sure thank you for participating in the webinar tonight.
Can you guys hear me okay? I'm sorry. Dr.
Yes.
Lewis and Ashley, I've got you both live now, and we've got a few questions coming in. Our first is, must a veterinarian view animals before issuing a VFD? So I guess that goes to what is the veterinary client-patient relationship definition?
So going back to, this is Craig Lewis. Going back to the key concepts specified under the VCPR definition, one of those key concepts was knowledge of the patient by virtue of examination and/or visits to the facility where the patient is managed. So this sort of captures the degree of knowledge that would be required in order to be a valid VCPR under either the federal or the state definition. So that does not necessarily mean an examination for each individual authorization, but is intended to be the minimum criteria for familiarity and knowledge with the care and keeping of the animals.
Very good. I've got a few questions that I can answer really quickly. One is about the recording. If you got on a little late into the presentation, this is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording here within 2 days. As long as all of our technology is working well, it should be available for your viewing by Thursday. Another question that was sent in, what is the maximum length of a VFD? There was discussion about the expiration date, but I don't think you guys, either one of you, covered what the maximum length of a VFD could be.
That'd be 6 months would be the maximum length, and that length only applies if there is no length stated on the label. The label speaks first, and if the label doesn't speak to that, then the maximum would be 6 months, and the veterinarian would also be able to specify a shorter duration than that 6 months.
That's correct. In the case of the currently approved VFD products, which are the the 3 drugs which I mentioned in the presentation. For example, one of them specifies a maximum of 42 days, I believe. So the vet could specify a shorter period than that. But in the case of the products that are changing from OTC to VFD under guidance 213, at the end of 2016, those products don't have an expiration date, a VFD expiration date set as part of their approval, so most of those will likely default to the 6-month period. And again, to clarify that that's the expiration date as opposed to the duration of use. The expiration date applies to the period during which animals can be legally fed. They can't be fed outside of that, whereas the duration of use is the length of time that any individual animal can be treated.
Very good. Another interesting question. The concept of a premises was mentioned earlier in reference to the VFD, and a lot of our producers associate premise ID with the Animal Disease Traceability Program. Is that what you mean by a premise, or define what the VFD is looking for as far as a premise?
Great question, and there are some more details in the rule itself. I didn't include those in the presentation today, but in the future we may adjust that somewhat. When we mean premise in the case of the VFD, it's the physical location where the animals are. In some cases, that could be the postal address. In other cases, a GPS coordinate or something like that. So it is not meant to specifically link to the premise ID, although it uses a similar term. This is really going back to the origin of the regulation back in 2000. So really it means either the geographic location where the animals are kept, mostly a postal code or a GPS coordinate or something like that.
Perfect. That's great clarification. I have several questions around the idea of availability of over-the-counter drugs. So could you address what will still be available over-the-counter, say January 2017, after all of the guidance and different regulations are fully in place?
Great. I'll give. This is Dr. Craig Lewis. I'll give a view from our end, and maybe Dr. Apley can jump in as well with a little more practical view as well. So as a few examples are things like bacitracin and ionophores, monensin, and so forth, at least as single ingredients, because those aren't considered medically important, even though they're in the feeder water. Those are not affected by guidance 213. So bacitracin and the ionophores will remain over the counter. Other things like injectable oxytetracycline and penicillins will remain over the counter because they are not administered in the feeder water. So those are a few examples of the sort of things that are impacted by guidance 213 and will remain over the counter at the beginning of 2017.
And one thing that I always like to point out about some of the over-the-counter availability, I'll ask everyone, when you purchase Procaine Penicillin G at a feed store or another outlet like that and take it home and use it as you normally do, or the vet uses it at that dose, do you need a prescription to do that? And the answer is yes, you do, and it's tricky because you're buying it from someone who's not licensed as a pharmacy to dispense based on a prescription. But your use of that drug outside the label, if you give 5 cc's per 100 pounds, your use of that drug outside the label indications does require a prescription, and the veterinarian within that prescription for that extra label use is responsible for applying and an extra long withdrawal time. And this is one of the reasons that I highly recommend to all producers that all of your antibiotic uses be discussed with your veterinarian.
Another interesting question, Dr. Apley, can you write a VFD for yourself to use on your own farm? Can a veterinarian write their own VFD for cattle that they own?
Dr. Lewis and I were just discussing that today, and to make sure that it is correct, Dr. Lewis, I'm going to let you describe what criteria they would need to meet.
So the VFD regulation effectively specifies 3 different parties in the exchange: the veterinarian, the client, and the distributor. It is possible for there to be less than 3 individual people that cover those 3 parties. One common scenario is in the case where a producer can effectively be the client and the distributor. So in that case, they would have to meet both the requirements for the client under the VFD as well as the distributor requirements. But however, there's also situations where a veterinarian is the owner and as well as the feed manufacturer in the case, for instance, of a vet who owns a feedlot. In that case, they could be all 3 parties in the VFD authorization, and in which case they would have to meet all the requirements of all 3 parties, of the vet, of the distributor, and of the client in that exchange. But yes, a single individual could effectively be both veterinarian and client in the VFD authorization process.
Another really interesting question for folks that buy, say, in a stocker background or type environment where you're bringing cattle in and feeding a starter ration that is medicated, but you buy in bulk and you're in a dry climate, you may store feed for 7 or 8 months. You're only feeding that feed to those cattle on receiving, so maybe they get fed for 21 days that particular ration, and then they're moved onto something that's not medicated. How would that effectively work with a feed that's being stored longer than the 6 months?
You would need to have a VFD in place when the feed was fed. In order to feed that feed to animals, a veterinary feed directive would need to be in effect, and would need to be in effect for the entire period that feed was fed.
That's correct, and I would just add that there's really 2 scenarios where you could bring medicated feed onto your facility, and one is under a valid VFD, so you'd actually be receiving it under an effective, valid VFD. The other scenario is where you are essentially receiving it as a distributor. So in the first case, if you're receiving the VFD feed, you would need a VFD authorized by your veterinarian. In the latter case, you would be acting as a distributor and would have to meet all the requirements of a VFD distributor, including a one-time notification to FDA that you intend to distribute VFD feeds, as well as providing an acknowledgement letter to the entity who you are receiving, the other distributor effectively, who you'd be receiving the VFD feed from. So you could effectively bring, and under that latter case, you could bring onto your feed manufacturing facility really the VFD feed without a VFD drug, but in order to begin feeding that drug, that feed, you would need a valid and effective VFD.
Here's a question around, I have several questions actually around the veterinary client-patient relationship. Do you have suggestions for underserved areas for, where there's just not a large animal vet close by, and or there have been instances where a veterinarian and a producer may not see eye to eye. So maybe they had a veterinary client-patient relationship, but it's no longer really in effect because they're not communicating on these issues, and the producer does not want to use that veterinarian any longer, but he doesn't have a lot of other options. What can we do in those cases?
The vet access issue is one of the concerns that we've one of the motivators really for updating the VFD regulation in order to make it more efficient and to really allow for kind of proactive planning for up to half a year at a time to anticipate your expected animal health needs and to be able to plan for that sort of thing. To minimize the amount of individual times you have to interface with the veterinarian. We also we worked with USDA to held a number of public meetings across the country going back a few years ago to help build some of that feedback into this final regulation to the extent we can to make it workable in those cases. And it does relate back to the changes to the VCPR and our attempt to defer to the state as the primary regulator of the practice of vet medicine, and particularly in those states which are affected by the relative lack of veterinary services, the individual situation in the given states. We're hoping to build in some of that sort of flexibility with these changes to the rule, while still indicating sort of some minimal criteria for the vet to be knowledgeable with the care and keeping of those animals and so forth. We're attending to accommodate for that, but really this is a balance and between the federal regulation and really appropriately deferring to the states wherever possible for the regulation of vet medicine.
All right, Dr. Apley's never had a disagreement with a producer. He's not going to weigh in on that one, I don't guess. All right, let's see here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question along the same lines with veterinary client-patient relationship. Is there any time frame for a VCPR, or as long as there's a relationship in place, I guess it doesn't expire?
I'm sorry, I didn't. Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure I quite understood that.
Is there a specific time frame in any of this regulation for a VCPR, for a veterinary client-patient relationship, or is it in effect, unless the parties are no longer in the relationship, I guess?
Effectively, is this getting to the idea of how frequent, when was the last time the vet may have some interaction with either the client or animals? Is that?
I think that's part of it. Also, I guess is there a minimum amount of time that you should have had a relationship with that vet, or the question that you're asking as well is, how recent has the vet seen my animals, that sort of thing.
Okay, well, so the VCPR definition, a lot of it does fall on the veterinarian themselves, and it at least is the key criteria that we're specifying. One that the vet is really assuming a responsibility for making clinical judgments and committing to be able to provide any necessary follow-up. So the amount of time necessary for the vet to make that commitment to assume responsibility and to provide the necessary follow-up is it's hard to set a timeline on that, but it's really a responsibility that falls on the vet in terms of their comfort level there. and the sufficiency of knowledge of the patient by virtue of examination and or visits to the facility where the patient is managed is potentially will depend a bit on individual circumstances, and again, we'd like to work with our state partners as much as possible on the details of that. This would mainly come up in individual circumstances, so it's really hard to make a blanket statement. But really, these are things that fall to the vet in terms of their comfort of assuming this responsibility, and that they have and can demonstrate that they have the sufficient knowledge and are available for that sort of follow-up.
I'll just add that I've worked with veterinarians with differing opinions, and you know, going back to prescriptions, which have been, you know, our way of working within a VCPR up to this date. Prior to the widespread adoption of VFDs, we've had some VFDs, but I've seen quite varying periods from veterinarians depending on their relationship with the practitioner or the client and the nature of the production system, etc. So it is a local standard of practice. It is up to the veterinarian to determine that, and they're the ones that drive that.
Just a couple of more questions and we'll wrap this up, try to get in close to an hour. Would either of you like to give an estimate of what you think it would take as far as time to secure a VFD for a producer? I know that there's so many different circumstances, but we have had that question a couple of times. How long is it going to take me to get a VFD?
You know, it's going to depend on how long it takes that veterinarian to be comfortable with your operation and the need for the VFD and how it can be managed. If it's an ongoing relationship with a pretty intimate knowledge, you're looking at the time for a quick discussion and the paperwork. Or if it's a refill, or not a refill, but you know, a new VFD following another one that's largely similar, it may be the time to fill out an electronic VFD after a brief communication. So you're looking at a half hour. If you're coming in with something entirely new to a veterinarian and they're needing to decide exactly how it can be managed, how it will be used, and need to start from scratch and discern a lot of those things that are going to be filled in that Dr. Lewis talked about, the components of a VFD, you know, you could be talking some substantial time. So just like the duration of a VCPR, it really, really depends.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And there's the time to fill out the individual form, which the vet has the option of creating their own form, you know, from a blank sheet of paper, for example, for each individual circumstance, as long as it meets all the requirements in the regulation, includes all the required information, that can be valid. That may take a tremendous amount of time just to fill out the form. On the far end of the spectrum, there's the potential for electronic services with forms which are mostly pre-populated, other than the client and the animal indication, and are already specific for the drug. So that may be a much quicker process just to fill out the form itself. But it's a totally different question, the amount of time it takes to reach the medical decision that if and what drug needs to be used for what purpose and what sort of animals, and outside of that, to establish the you know, relationship and comfort that would cover the vet client patient relationship.
This question came in and must have been in the presentation. What is a presumptive diagnosis?
Well, a presumptive diagnosis would be one where I am already familiar with the care and keeping of the animals, with your ability, we've worked together, your ability to observe clinical signs, and you describe clinical signs, and I make a presumptive diagnosis based on those, or I have examined and evaluated the animals, and absent of further diagnostics, I make a presumptive diagnosis that this is the disease. Dr. Lewis, is there a statutory definition of that?
Not that I'm aware of. I apologize for not having a confident answer. I'll follow up to confirm, but my working understanding is similar to yours. I'll have to confirm whether there is a statutory or regulatory definition.
Okay.
There are a couple of producers that may have come on a little bit late and are asking a question about milk replacer or raising dairy calves or bottle calves. So could you just briefly recap that situation and how it's handled in the VFD?
Yes, a milk replacer is a feed, so it would be handled in the same manner as a total mixed ration put in the bunk or a mineral, in that any medically important antibiotic would require a veterinary feed directive to be used in milk replacer, and no extra label use of any feed additive placed in milk replacer is allowed.
Yep, that's right. Any of the current OTC, medically important milk replacers, starting in the beginning of 2017, January 1st, 2017, we expect to require a veterinary feed directive in order to use them, and only for their approved indications.
All right. Well, thank you again to our presenters. You guys are just very generous with your time tonight, answering the questions and doing the presentation, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you all for joining, and you will receive a link to the recorded webinar here in a few days. Hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you all.